Hello everybody, this has been a popular request, so we're going to talk about melee combat. I'm going to talk about setting up two-handed grabbable objects. Now this is in the context of melee weapons, but it relates to anything you want to be two-handed grabbable, fixing issues with grabbable objects colliding with the enemy, considering different types of grabbable physics spelled wrong objects, setting up necessary colliders, doing damage to the enemy, and having the enemy do damage to the player when hit. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to start with this key stuff here, getting the object to be grabbable. I've set up a scene already, and the scene I've got has got a skeleton in it who's going to prove to be our enemy we need to defeat, and I've set up a sword. These are just simple things from the asset store. I've had to set up some animations from the skeleton from Mixamo, but the sword is pretty much stock. What you will notice about the sword that I've set up, if I actually select the sword in the hierarchy and open it up, you'll notice the sword when I originally downloaded it from the asset store was just a 3D model, and I've added all of these things. So that's what it came as. I've added an empty game object to become the hit point. The way you add an empty game object, if you remember, is you right click on the parent and you choose create empty. That will create a point that you can just move around. I've created one of those empty game objects to be the hold point, so the point that will hold it in one of the hands. The same for the second hand further on down in the hilt, because I want this to be a two-handed sword, though it can work with just one hand as well. I also want there to be a zone that is grabbable, and I also want there to be a series of colliders, which are actually the things that the sword will detect hits from. So if I turn those back on, all those colliders are cubes that I've scaled to be roughly the right size. So you can see there's just a cube there, and then there's a smaller one towards the end, and I've just given this one a colour because that's going to be the one we want to actually be grabbable. Now if you're making a weapon, you don't want the player to be able to pick it up by the pointy end. Let's say we want them to be able to pick it up by the hilt of the sword, probably, or the handle. So what I've done is, within my sword in the XRGrab interactable, is I've overwritten the original collider. If you don't put anything in that slot in this colliders box here, it will just assume all of the colliders within this object are fair game for you to grab, but I don't want them to be able to grab it by the pointy end, or over here I want them to have to grab it by this point on the sword. So what I've done is I've just grabbed the bit which is the grab zone, dragged and dropped it over the word colliders, and it's set that there. Or you can click plus, and that's got a box for you to populate with whatever colliders you want to be a grabbable point, and you can have many. You'll notice I've also made the select mode to be multiple. By default it's single. If you just want a single-handed weapon, single will do the trick. But I'm using multiple here to demonstrate how easy it is to set up. Just going to set that back to my first example, which is movement type of instantaneous. And you'll also notice I've set an attach transform, which is the hold point, which is this point here where we want them to hold with one hand, and the second hold point there, which is the second hand, and that's attach transform 0.1 and secondary attach transform as well. So let me show you what that does. I will keep the colliders visible just so you can see it for ease of demonstration. Just need to quickly sort out an issue with the headset. It's taken this moment to reset itself. There we go. So what we can hopefully see, and hopefully OBS is recording, is we've got our scene, we've got our skeleton over there just cycling through its idle and its attack animation. That will prove important later. And I've got a sword which I cannot grab by the pointy end, but I can grab by this point here. I've had to rotate the attach transforms so the sword is pointing the correct way. You may have to do the same. And what you'll notice is, out of the box, this sword can interact with other objects within my scene. It can travel through surfaces. It just completely ignores the enemy. I am sitting down, which explains the weird height issues. And I'm trying to move around in my scene. And you'll notice if I bring the sword close to me, I get some really strange behaviours. Especially when I'm trying to move forward, the sword is pushing me back. If you remember from the Christmas tutorial, you end up with the problem of, if you've got a physics object in your hand and you're trying to walk into it, it will physically push you away. So before we do anything else, we need to resolve that issue. The way you resolve an issue with physics objects that are grabbable is you need to use physics layers. Unity just calls them layers. So anything I want to be grabbable, I'm going to create a layer for it over here. I'm going to add a layer, and I'm going to make one for the player and one for anything that is grabbable. So I'm going to create a player layer, and I'm going to create one for things that we can grab. Remember, creating the layers doesn't do anything. You then need to select on every grabbable object, make sure it's on the grabbable layer. Yes, affect the children. Then I want to go to my player XR origin, put it on the player layer, but do not affect children. I don't want the hands or the controllers to be on the non-grab layer, because that doesn't make sense. Then to make it work, you go to Edit and Project Settings, and under the Physics tab, when you scroll down, there's an option here which is your physics matrix. I don't want things that are grabbable to interact with my player in any way, so we can just tick that and toggle it off, and that will fix that problem. I've got confidence that's going to work, so I'm not going to demonstrate it, but you should test it when you're doing it as well. What we then want to consider is within our sword, just showing that the grab works. So I'm just going to show you the grabbable nature of it, and I'm going to show you what happens if we edit the grabbable type. So by making this a multi-grab object, I can grab it by the grab point, I can use the left hand to grab it by the grab point again, and you'll now see it's rotating around in my hand because I've got 2 grab points. If I hold my hands together, I can slash the sword. If I move my hands apart, it will kind of follow the rotation. Again, this is very good for two-handed weapons, whether that's ranged weapons or these all pointy sticks or whatever you might conceivably want. And that feels really quite nice. But we do have this problem with the sword, which is it goes through stuff. Again, if I go over to our Skelly over here with our kind of small sword by comparison, just travels straight through. Any physics object, it will move. But again, you can see there, because it's in my hand, it's just going through an object, but when I let go, it won't. And that's what that collider is doing. Now, you may find that that behaviour, that instantaneous behaviour, is not what you want. So with my sword selected, we've got the movement type, which by default is set to instantaneous. It's the simplest, it's the most straightforward, and in many cases, it's the best. But I'm going to show you an alternative. An alternative is velocity tracking. This turns your grabbable object and it keeps physics active while it's in your hand. It's far from perfect, so let me show you why this may be more desirable and the problems with it. There are plenty of sliders you can fiddle with as well to get good behaviours, but now with that sword in my hand, you'll notice there's very jittery motion. However, I can no longer push it through the table. If I move my hands, it will get as close as possible and then stop at the table. That will give me much better interactions with this object, and there are no colliders on here, but it would stop if it was. You can see, however, the very jerky motion, I mean extremely jerky motion, when you are turning with the weapon or if you are moving with it. And the reason for that is the player is moving every frame. However, physics objects move at a set rate of 60 frames per second, so you end up with a disconnect between the two systems. You find that if you use teleport, that becomes less of an issue, but it's still very much an issue. I don't know how to make that better. I'm investigating it, but suffice it to say I'm not too sure how to resolve that. So I generally stick with instantaneous, but you've got a choice. There is also kinematic as well, which you can play with. So far we have set up two-handed grabbable melee weapons. We've fixed the issue with grabbable objects colliding with the player. And now we're going to consider, well, we've just considered different types of grabbable physics objects. Yeah, totally typos, deliberate there. Can't be dealing with it being spelled wrong. There we go. And we've set up the necessary colliders on the object. Again, just to detail that one more, I've got all of these colliders. I've just got an empty game object holding those colliders. That's just cube 1, cube 2, the pointy bits of the sword. And I can click on each of those colliders and turn off the mesh renderer. It will keep the collision surface, but will turn off the renderer. And I'm going to do the same for the grab zone, which I've done here, which is just a box. And obviously now in game, that would look far better. What I am going to show you, I'm going to go slightly off my original plan here. So the grab zone, the mesh renderer, Sorry, I've turned the mesh renderer off. I want to keep the grab zone on, but just turn the mesh renderer off. All I'm going to show you here is a little trick that you might use if you want to make it clear to your player that something is grabbable. I'm going to go to the grab interactable, and I'm going to go down to the interactable events. I'm going to say when we hover over this object, and remember the only thing that detects whether we're hovering over it is that grabbable zone. Everything else shouldn't detect that it's being hovered over. So I'm going to click add to add an event, and I'm going to say when I hover over this sword, tell the grab zone to do something. And what I want the grab zone to do is to go to its mesh renderer and turn it back on. So I should have an enabled option in here, Boolean enabled. I will turn it on when I hover over it, and I'm going to do the exact same thing in reverse. Grab zone, mesh renderer, enabled, false when I'm not hovering over it. You'll notice that again XR didn't have to code anything to do that. Now I haven't tested this, so if this is going to work I'll be quite chuffed. I hover over it, does it appear? Yeah, there you go. So you can sometimes use this technique to make it clearly visible that something's there. Okay, just be aware that it will always pop up when you hover over it, irrespective of which hand. So just be aware that may not always be the best technique, but it works. Also notice that it works for one hand. If you take it in the left hand and swap it, it'll swap. So it's still working single hand as well as multi-grab. Okay, you will notice some inconsistencies there again because it's detecting a hover briefly, but you get the idea. It gives some affordance to the player, gives some information to the player that that is the grabbable bit. Maybe you like that, maybe you don't. So we've got our collider set up. Now we're going to go and do damage. This is what we're interested in, doing damage to the enemy. What we need to do first is make sure that our enemy has something we can hit. Remember, a 3D object is not collidable by default. We need to give it some collision surfaces in which to do that. The easiest way to do this is just like we did with our sword. Right click, create a 3D object, make a cube or a sphere or a capsule or whatever. Make it roughly the right size. There's a reason why they call them hitboxes, guys. So there's our cube. I'm going to make it invisible by deactivating the mesh renderer, and I'm going to make it a trigger because I don't actually want it to be a physics object. I just want it to detect when the sword has hit it. So that'll work, but if I show you, I'm just going to turn the mesh renderer on so you can still see the box. When I press play and look at it in scene mode, you'll see that that kind of follows the point of origin for our enemy. But that's kind of it. You know, that'll be alright, but it won't detect whether you're hitting it in the arm, or it'll detect if you're hitting it up here, which is miles away from the head. It's an okay solution. I'm going to show you how to carry on using this solution, but if you want to make it a little bit more advanced, if I just turn that off so it's easy to see, what you can instead do is go into the root and the skeletal structure of whatever enemy you've got, in this case spine. If ever you've got a long bunch of stuff you need to open up, by the way, you can press Alt and left click. That will either toggle it all closed or toggle it all open, so that can be very useful for bone structures, by the way. So that was Alt and left click. The alternative option here is you go into each of the individual bones, literally one by one, and you do the same thing. You apply a box collider around that literal bone. So I'm just going to do this to the head because that seems really easy. I'm going to make a child to the head, which is going to be a 3D object and a simple cylinder, sphere. Sphere is kind of head-shaped. Shrink that down, shrink that down, shrink that down. Move it up, move it up, move it up. Yeah, you can make this as perfect as you wanted just using these basic colliders. Notice, however, that with this sphere, changing the shape of the sphere is not changing the shape of the collider because it's a sphere collider. So if you wanted to make something that is like oval, let's try a capsule instead. So I'm going to go 3D object, capsule. My capsule is way too big in the wrong shape. There's our Tic Tac of Doom. I'm going to shrink that capsule down. I'm going to change it onto Z axis. No, I'm not. I'm just going to rotate it. And then you can use your scale tools as you normally would. Excuse me. And then there you go. You've got it's a shape. There you go. That would encompass the head, and that would follow the bone around rather than just following the centre of mass for the object, which was what our box collider was going to do. So you can see that's now much more closely following the head, and we would turn off our mesh renderer as well because we care about the collider but we don't care about the 3D object. There we go, he's giving us a little nod, which is quite nice. So I'm going to keep that capsule on, but I'm also going to keep, for easy testing, that large box we applied wherever we put our box. I'm going to assume the bottom. There's cube, let's turn cube back on. Ugly, 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 but what we care about is them both being triggers. Let me just make sure I did actually tell that one to be a trigger. I did not. So triggers, if you remember, have a different behaviour to other things. I will keep the mesh renderers on while I'm doing this just to show it works. A trigger, if you remember, is a zone that detects interaction, whereas a true collider that is not a trigger is a physics bounce point. So we want to tell our sword, when our sword hits our dude, do some damage. Now that's an okay way of doing it, telling the sword to do damage to the enemy, but it may be better for the enemy to detect has it been hit by the sword. It's a little bit of a better way of managing it. In order to do this, we need to make sure that the sword has some kind of tag, some kind of identifier to know that it is a weapon, and it probably needs to know how much damage it can do, but we're going to keep it simple for now. So I'm going to create a tag for our sword. I'm going to call it, rather unsurprisingly, sword. With our sword selected, I'm going to make sure that it's tagged as sword, but I'm also going to make sure all of its children are as well, because when it checks for collisions and it goes, does it have that tag, it checks the thing that triggered the collision. So in this case, the pointy bits are these bits here, and you'll notice they didn't inherit the same tag by choosing the top level. So I'm going to select all of the bits of the sword and make sure they've all got the sword tag, not just the parent. So what we're going to do with our skelly over here, with our skeleton selected, hidden behind our big fridge, is we're going to tell our skeleton, let's write a script for it, let's call it enemy health. And enemy health's job is to know when something's entered into one of its trigger zones, and if that thing had the tag of sword, well, to hurt it and then eventually kill it. So we don't care about a start function or an update function. What we care about is knowing, by being publicly available, the amount of HP our enemy has. And if you remember, that's going to be probably a decimal number, so let's declare it as a float. Let's give it a name, perhaps HP, both uppercase, and give it an initial value. 100 makes sense. Semicolon to say that you're done. What we then care about is on trigger enter. If you've got the autocomplete switched on, you can just choose on trigger enter, press enter, and it will write it all out. If the autocomplete is not working for you, remember that's under edit, preferences, external tools, and choose Visual Studio from the drop down, and then restart Visual Studio. So something is entered in a trigger on this object or a child of this object. Remember, we're on the skeleton right now. We need to check if the other thing, again this word here, other, that's what it's relating to, the other collider involved with this interaction. If the other thing had a tag and that tag was equal to sword, then what we're going to do is take HP and reduce it. Minus equals, 10 points per hit. Really simple to start with. What I'm then also going to do is inside of that an if statement. If HP is less than or equal to 0, our skelly is dead. Destroy. And destroy is a keyword that needs to know something. What am I destroying? If I write the word game object with a lowercase g but an uppercase O, that will destroy the game object this script is attached to. If I wanted to destroy the sword for whatever reason, I could destroy the other thing involved in this collision. Okay, so that's what we're going to check, and we're going to see if this works. I think in order for quick testing, I will just make the cube invisible by turning the mesh render off. That's a wonderfully ridiculous sight. It looks like I've made a Lego man. And I'm going to keep an eye on this enemy health script that should be on our skeleton. You guys will be able to see this better than me because I'll have a headset on. So let's see if this works. I pick up the sword, walk over to our skelly, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 hits, keep hitting them, keep hitting them, keep hitting them. Are we getting hit detections? No. So let's diagnose what went wrong there. To diagnose when you've got a problem like this, we need to go through our steps. On trigger enter was the other thing a sword. So the first thing we need to know is, was a trigger even being detected? So to do this, we're going to do a debug.log. Again, you guys do not need to do this. You can just cut to the bit of the video where I solve the problem. But I'm just putting a little message in here to say, display that there was a hit. And then I can find out if there's a problem between other things as well. It should have detected that there was a collider entering the trigger zone. Perhaps it's not detecting the sword for whatever reason. Okay. For testing, I'm not going to pop the headset on. I'm literally just going to grab the sword in the scene mode. And I'm just going to move the sword over. That's no good. I've dropped my sword. Well, that was more difficult than I thought. On our skeleton, did that do any damage? I didn't get a debug message. Let's try it in headset. We didn't get a debug message, so that tells us the on trigger enter is not firing. What on trigger enter does is it looks at all children of it for colliders, but because I'm just a little bit unsure why this isn't working, I'm going to put a box collider at this level, make that a trigger and make that huge. Does that solve the problem, or have I completely got the wrong end of the stick of how swords are going to work? That worked. Okay, it's just not detecting the children. I'm going to try flipping this on its head. Again, guys, apologies for this not working first time. But it gives you an opportunity to see the process. Let's go to the sword. I'm going to add a new script here called do damage. And I'm going to flip the logic around. This was the way I was originally going to do it, but I didn't think it was going to be the best way. Do damage. What should do damage do? Because I may have got my logic wrong in its head. On trigger enter. If the other thing has a tag, keep in mind we are the sword, so we're checking for another tag of enemy. We haven't yet set a tag, but we will do in a minute. Debug.log. Sword hit, and let's leave it at that for debugging. Not going to work until I give the enemy the tag of enemy. Skeletal warrior has the tag of enemy. Did I actually give it the tag of enemy? Skeletal warrior, no, has the tag of enemy. So just remember, when you do create a tag, you must then assign it. I'm going to come back to this problem. It's annoying me. So let's just highlight that in red. We'll come back to that one. Let's flip it on its head and let's do this bit. Having the enemy do damage to the player when hit during an animation. So in order to hurt the player has to know how much damage it can take, so it probably needs some kind of health script. So with the XR origin selected, I'm going to add a health script. We've got one for enemy health, but we want specifically one for the player, so let's call it health. You could call it player health or whatever you wanted. And all player health is going to do is to keep a log of how much health we've got. So I'm going to call this public float player HP, setting that to 100 as well, its initial value, and that's all we're going to do to start off with. We'll just have the amount of player HP. What I wanted to show you guys now is when you create an animation or you use an animation on an object. So with my skeletal warrior selected, we've got an animation for our skeletal warrior that looks like this. And keep in mind it's just jumped to this position because that's the preview of the animation. If you remember when we went back to the vault door and we did things like player sound at a point in an animation, you will see that we've got this animation and we want to do damage probably at that point of the animation where the sword is at its longest and bam, should do damage to the player around then. An easy way of doing damage to a player is just say, when I'm within range, I'm playing this animation, trickle some damage away, and it feels like you've been poisoned and you're slowly trickling damage away. That's a simple way of doing it, but what we want to do is bam, and we're going to do that here. We set up an event to occur at that point. In order for the event to do something, there must be a script on the skeleton that the event looks up. I'm going to add a component, and this is going to be called enemy do damage. Why not? And that's a new script. And what we want enemy do damage to do is to say, I want to look up the player at this point, go find the player irrespective of where they are in the map and hurt them. Because this is a function, it starts public void and we're going to call it hurt player. And all hurt player is going to do, to keep it really simple, is it will find, so that is game object with a capital G, game object dot find game object with tag. Notice it's object, not objects. Find game object with tag, and the tag we are looking for is player. We haven't set this up yet, but we're looking for the player. So we're going to find the player, we're going to get a component on the player, and the component we are looking for is health. And if you remember, health only has one thing that it knows at the minute, which is how much HP we've got. If we're keeping it simple, we could just say take that player HP and subtract something from it. That would work if I were testing this, but I'm aware of your time and this tutorial has already become quite long. So what is actually better to do is in the player's health script, have a function in there calling that take damage. I'll put capital T there. When we take damage, we take the player HP, subtract it by a number, and we can make this more or less clever, but I'm just going to say 10. And just like we were doing before, if player HP is less than or equal to 0, something bad has happened and probably it's game over or you restart. But again, for testing, debug.log, player is dead. And you would put whatever you wanted there to happen. So when the enemy does damage, it's no longer going to take 10 HP away. What we're now going to do is take the health script and look up that, did we call it do damage? We called it take damage. Call the take damage function and we will now take player. The problem with this script is it will do it no matter where the player is, But if we set up our animation states correctly, we'll say only play this animation, the sword swinging animation, if the player is within range. Now we could tidy this up even further, but again we're acutely aware I want to keep this as an intro tutorial. So right now, when our enemy is swinging his sword, at about that point, we're going to add an event. You click this button here, add an event. And then the event says, you can just see it's highlighted there, it's appeared this little down arrow. I'm going to click on that and it says, well, what event, what function do you want me to do? And we'll choose from the list. It will show you all of the functions that all of the scripts on this object has, and we want to hurt the player at that point of the animation. And it will go and find whatever's got the tag of player, find the health script on it, and take 10 points away. So if we go to the XR origin, make sure it's got a tag of player, which is a predefined one, and I'm going to keep a close eye on the player health. Keeping in mind I've set my animation up to automatically loop the attack animation, so I expect to be losing HP every time it swings its sword. This is not, there we go. So I think that's part of the idle animation, and then you've got the sword swing, which was there. And you can see it's taking 10 HP away at each time. I'm not in headset at the minute, I'm just keeping an eye on what this dude is doing. There you go, so taking damage. Again, you would set your animations up so that animation only plays if the enemy is within reach or whatever it is, and you go from there. I'm not going to include that in this tutorial. You can go back to the Vault Door tutorial about transitioning to animations when you're within a certain range of something or something has happened. Right, you could leave that tutorial there. We've done all of those bits apart from the red bit, which I'm now going to try and solve. Apologies for this. I normally do a quick test tutorial beforehand, but again, keeping an eye on the time today, it was difficult to do that. So why is our sword not hurting our skelly? May have to be a little bit more complicated here. I don't want to have to attach this script to all of the colliders in the warrior, which is what I think we may have to do. I don't want to do that. Come back for part 2 once I've figured it out. Talk to you all later.